Okay, boys and girls, we're moving on with our book. We see now how Dr. Barnes plans to use the newspaper to get rid of Mr. Larson. So we've got to see what happens. We know that Mr. Larson has decided that the way he's going to deal with it is not to be angry, but to actually teach. So, Chapter 17, Rescue Squad Tackles Cleanup. Kara felt awful. Mr. Larson had just told the class that the Landry News could not be published anymore, at least not right away. He had made transparencies of the letters from Dr. Barnes and put them on the overhead projector so the whole class could see them while he explained what was happening. Then he showed a transparency of the story about the boy and the divorce. Mr. Larson said, "Now, it's important for each of us to think very clearly about all this." Glancing over the 23 faces looking up at him from the darkened room, his eyes met Kara's for a moment before looking back at the screen. Some of you might be tempted to think, oh, if only we had not published this one little story, everything would be all right. But is that true? No, it's not. Because if it wasn't this story, it would have been some other story, or some review of a movie, or a review of a book that someone does not like. You have to remember that publishing this story was the right thing to do. It's a wonderful story and a brave story, and I know that it was very good for a lot of people to read it and think about it. And a lot of people have told me that it's the best thing the Landry News has published so far. So that's the good thing. The paper just told the truth. It sounded good, hearing Mr. Larson say it like that, but it didn't make Kara feel any better. She had a copy of the newspaper on her desk, and her thoughts went round and round. I should have known better. I should have thought about Mr. Larson instead of this stupid paper. I should have just handed that story right back to Michael Morton. I should have known better. The classroom snapped back into focus for Kara as Mr. Larson turned off the overhead projector and Sharon flipped on the lights. As the kids squinted and blinked, Mr. Larson said, "So someone thinks that divorce is too personal to write about in a school newspaper. I'm the teacher in charge, so I'm the one responsible. So it looks like I'm suddenly in trouble. But am I?" Picking his way over to the bulletin board, Mr. Larson tapped the Bill of Rights poster and then rested the pointer on the First Amendment. Am I in trouble here, or is something else in trouble? Mr. Larson could see by their faces that all the kids got the idea. It was Kara who said it. She said, "It's the First Amendment that's in trouble. The freedom of the press is in trouble." Then she frowned and said, "But I still think you're in trouble too." Mr. Larson grinned, touched by Kara's concern. "Well, I am perfectly sure that there's nothing for any of us to worry about. We've all been doing good work here, and now, thanks to this situation, we're going to get to learn about the freedom of the press in a way that very few teachers or kids will ever get to. Besides, I've been in trouble before, and let me tell you, I think this is the best trouble I've ever been in." A few of the kids laughed a little when Mr. Larson said that, but not Kara. Walking toward the front of the room, Mr. Larson glanced at her. She sat stiffly in her chair, glaring at her copy of the Landry News, biting her lower lip. Back at his desk, Mr. Larson picked up the stack of stapled handouts and passed them around. "This is your study packet for this unit. Take a look at page 1 with me." For the next 10 minutes, Mr. Larson walked the class through all the steps in the process, things that would happen before the hearing, at the hearing, and after the hearing. He wanted to make sure that there was nothing mysterious, nothing scary about any of it. He did not paint Dr. Barnes as a villain or himself as a victim. It was not us against them. It was just a contest between two different ideas of what was right. What was the greatest good for the greatest number? As Mr. Larson calmly explained everything, Kara relaxed a little. He wasn't just pretending to be brave. Kara could tell he was truly excited about all of this. And when Mr. Larson squinted and rubbed his hands together and said, It's like we get to mess around in our own private democracy laboratory. Even Kara had to smile. She flipped ahead to look at the last page of the handout, looking for a clue about where this whole thing would end up. There was only one word on the last page: conclusions. The rest of the page was blank. That blank page was actually comforting to Kara. She was used to looking at blank pages, and she was used to filling them up with things that were true and good. To Kara, that final page looked like hope. Chapter 18. Censorship plus computers equals no way. Joey sat next to Kara on the bus that Monday afternoon. He was quiet, and so was Kara. Even after all the explanations, she still felt responsible for the whole mess, especially for what was happening to Mr. Larson. There was a lot to think about. Joey broke the silence with a question. So you're going to keep on publishing the paper anyway, right? Kara's ponytail wagged as she shook her head. We can't, Joey. If we don't obey the rules, it will just make it harder for Mr. Larson. They were quiet again, looking out the windows on opposite sides of the bus for the next 2 stops. Then, as if a puppet master had rotated their heads at exactly the same moment, they faced each other and both started talking at once. But the letter said the Landry News, said Kara. It didn't say stop making all newspapers. I know, blurted Joey. As long as we don't make a newspaper at school or pass it out there, we can publish anything we want to. As long as it's true. Joey was practically shouting. And why? Because it's a free country, that's why. Kara had hold of Joey's arm, squeezing it, and her voice had gone up an octave. So you've got a computer, right? She asked. Joey nodded, and Kara went on. And you've got a printer, too. Joey nodded again and said, It's not as big as the one at school, but it's a good one, and it even prints in color. We'll have to redesign everything for a smaller sheet size, but that's okay, because it's a whole new paper anyway. Kara stayed on the bus and rode to Joey's stop. Leanne and Alan and Ed had joined the conversation, and in 4 minutes they had already taken a unanimous vote on the new name that Ed came up with. By the time they got off the bus and had begun to walk the last block to Joey's house, the publishing committee had offered Kara Landry the job of editor-in-chief for a brand new newspaper, The Guardian, and she accepted, provided that the motto of the new paper could still be the same: truth and mercy. Halfway through science on Friday morning, Mrs. Colmier arrived with an invitation for Kara Landry. The principal wanted to talk to her. A few minutes later, Kara sat across the desk from Dr. Barnes. She was glad she had experience in these matters. Remember, this is where it kind of goes back to where Kara used to get in trouble quite a bit. Kara had observed quite a few angry school administrators, at least one a week for most of 4th grade. She had developed what she called the Matameter. It was a scale from 1 to 10, where 1 equals mild tremor and 10 equals erupting volcano. Judging from the color of his face, the rate of his breathing, the flare of his nostrils, and the fact that both doors of his office were closed, Kara thought that Dr. Barnes was probably at about 8, the steaming mudslide stage. She waited politely for Dr. Barnes to begin the conversation. He slid a copy of The Guardian across the desk and turned it around so she could see it. The headline of the lead story was, Why the First Amendment is First. The article laid out the situation involving the Landry News, Mr. Larson, Denton Elementary School, and the Carlton School Board. Dr. Barnes had to admit to himself that it was a masterful piece of reporting. The story was honest, it was impartial, and it lived up to the newspaper's motto. Dr. Barnes cleared his throat and said, What is your connection with this newspaper, Kara? Kara disliked being treated like a baby. The masthead of the newspaper was on the front page, as plain as the nose on Dr. Barnes's face, and his nose was very plain from where Kara was sitting. The masthead listed all the workers on the paper. All 23 kids in Mr. Larson's afternoon class had wanted their names in the masthead, and each had done something to help get the Guardian pulled together in record time. Kara and Joey had gotten the idea on Monday afternoon, and the first edition had been ready to distribute today, Friday morning. Dr. Barnes was a tempting target, but Kara didn't get snippy, and she didn't get angry. She didn't even get sarcastic. She pointed meekly at the masthead. "It says what everyone does for the paper right here in the masthead. I'm the editor-in-chief." Dr. Barnes said, "I see. And weren't you the editor-in-chief of the Landry News as well?" Kara nodded. "Yes, until Mr. Larson told us we had to stop publishing it for a while." Kara already knew exactly where Dr. Barnes was headed with this. She did not want to suffer through a long and boring cat-and-mouse question session. Kara wanted to lay it all out on the table, and she also wanted Dr. Barnes to know right away that she saw what he was up to. So before Dr. Barnes could ask his next question, Kara said, "You probably think that this paper is just the Landry News, only with a different name. But it's not, Dr. Barnes. First, the Landry News was written and assembled and produced during school hours on school property, using school equipment and supplies. The Guardian was written outside of school, and it was produced in a private home using privately owned equipment and supplies. Second, the Landry News was distributed to students by other students during school hours on school property. The Guardian is distributed by a group of kids to their friends on privately owned property before or after school hours. And third, the Landry News was supervised by Mr. Larson, and from the second edition to the ninth edition and final edition, Mr. Larson saw every copy of it. The Guardian was thought up and created independently by only the friends listed here in the masthead, without adults being involved at all." Kara hadn't meant to push Dr. Barnes up toward the erupting volcano point, but the lava was starting to flow anyway. He glared at her and jabbed at the paper with his blunt index finger. "Young lady, do you mean to tell me that you did not intend to distribute these papers at school today? These papers are all over this school and all over the floors and all the buses." Kara said mildly, "We didn't bring a single paper to school. Honest. We have friends at almost every bus stop, and we had our newspapers ready this morning, so we handed them out. We even made sure that we stayed in someone's yard instead of on the sidewalk, because the sidewalk is owned by the town, and when kids are waiting for the school bus there, it's like school property. But after we handed the papers to our friends, where they took them, well, that wasn't up to us." Kara leaned forward and pointed at the little symbol Joey had added to the bottom of the front page. "We even reminded kids to be sure to recycle the paper." Kara sat up straighter in her chair and said, "Hey, I know. Next week we'll add 'Please don't litter' and see if that helps." Kara paused a minute, smiling absently at Dr. Barnes. Even his earlobes were red now. "And guess what?" said Kara brightly. "What?" said Dr. Barnes, almost in a whisper. "If you flip that paper over, down at the bottom, you can see our internet address. Isn't that cool? By this time next week, the Guardian will be online, and our internet edition won't use any paper at all. No litter. Isn't that great?" Dr. Barnes disliked displays of emotion, especially anger. It wasn't professional. So in an abnormally quiet voice, Dr. Barnes said, "Yes, that's a fine idea, Kara. Well then, please go out to the front office now and ask Miss Cormier for a pass to your class, and close the door behind you, please." 2 minutes later, Kara left the office. Dr. Barnes's door was still shut. If it hadn't been against the rules, Kara Landry would have skipped down the hall, all the way back to her science class.